Okay.
So I think we should be having around about 35, 40 people today.
Yep.
Mostly from CELC, but also from some other institutes in Singapore. And perhaps some people from New Zealand, perhaps.
Yeah, we might get a few. It's after hours for my folks, but I gave them the link. We'll see. Another one. Am I loud enough? Do you need me to crank volume? Is it sounding pretty good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Sure.
Hi, Anu.
Hey, Namala.
So we'll just wait for another few minutes just to see who else turns up.
Yeah.
Hi, Namala.
Hi, Jacques, how are you?
Good, thanks. I just want to say hi to Lucy. How are you, Lucy?
Hey, Josh. I made the connection when I was checking out your center. I'm like, now that's familiar. Congratulations
Good to see
on
you.
your edition. That was really great.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Definitely got at least one New Zealand buddy with me. Yeah, we're entering the time of people having to deal with children and dinner.
In the evening, yeah, in New Zealand. What time is it for you now, Lucy? About 6?
Yes, 5. Yep. Luckily, I checked. Yeah, daylight saving had kicked in for us, so
Yeah, that's always tricky.
temporary time zone panic, and then sorted.
Better than me. I sometimes log into roundtables and find out that they're then, 2 hours later. So I'm the only person in the room by myself for 10 minutes wondering where everyone is.
And of course, everyone else has got it wrong, not you.
Right. Mark, tell me when you'd like to get started. Shall we just, okay, just give a few more minutes.
Yeah.
Is it now 12?
Neil's here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can wait for a few minutes. It's up to Lucy
Yeah.
when she wants to start.
Yeah, tell us when.
I think 2 to 3 minutes is gentle leeway.
Hi, Daniel. Welcome to Singapore.
Namala, I'll let you deal with any late admissions. They'll pop
Yep,
up on
sure.
the screen, but I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
What do you reckon? Shall we roll?
Yeah, let's do it. All right. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to introduce one of my former colleagues from the University of from Sydney. She did her PhD in the University of Technology in Sydney on joint construction, and she's a very well known young career academic in systemic functional linguistics and legitimation code theory, using both approaches in English for academic purposes, a field which she's been working on for a very long time. So now Lucy works as a senior learning advisor at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. And she will be speaking to us today about interdisciplinary collaboration for embedded academic literacy development, looking at how she embeds SFL and LCT interventions into different faculties. So thank you so much, Lucy, for being here. We're really excited to hear you speak.
Thank you. It's wonderful to connect, even if it's through the screen. Great to join you. I've organised the talk today in two parts. The first part, I'd like to focus on teaching, looking in particular at a paper in the Masters of Nursing Science and another in the Bachelor of Education. And we're going to focus on a process of working with the lecturers that enable us to try to achieve this goal of doing something that is very targeted and specific to what students have to do. In the abstract, I had business. If you're particularly interested in that area, please contact me directly, because today I want to make time for the second part, which is sharing some research findings. Hot off the press, we would like to be able to share with you not just examples of how we collaborated, but some research around lecturers' perspectives and how they experience the whole process. And particularly this interesting issue of sustainability. Working with lecturers can be intensive. So what can we do to explore options to work in a sustainable way? Now, with this beautiful, generous time frame we have, I think, the part one, we can let it go for about 35, 40 minutes, and then let's pause, let's connect and have a chat, and then we can move into part two. Of all the definitions of academic literacy out there, I particularly like this one because it focuses on the students and what they have to do, the reading, evaluating, presenting, debating, creating, and it acknowledges different modes, of course, speaking and writing, but we know as assessment tasks change and develop that we're actually talking about many other modes as well. And it focuses on the things that are having to do being very discipline specific. In terms of development, a common socio-cultural view is thinking of it as learning how to make meaning, and this emphasis on disciplinary communities and specific social contexts. Now, when development is framed that way, we're actually talking about academic literacy development for everyone. And that view is really powerfully encapsulated in this quote. That academic discourse is actually no one's mother tongue, but of course, some groups of learners may find it easier than others. But this idea of context, this idea that no one has a ready-made toolkit where you have all that you need in any context you might encounter, this idea of specificity and particular communities means that we can really think about the fact that we all need it, and it's beautifully encapsulated in this quote by McCabe and Whitaker. In a sense, every new context is a possible site of exclusion based on illiteracy. What they're really saying here is, in any particular context, there's ways of making meaning for particular purposes, particular genres, and these have configurations of meaning that are very specific to settings, called register. And when we change the context, then our genres and our registers are going to shift. That's why academic literacy development can be approached as a lifelong process that we never fulfill, and we're always striving to develop further. This view, though, is not one that is necessarily shared structurally. So particularly in New Zealand and Australian contexts, you have universities being stuck a bit in thinking about this, academic literacy thing. Oh, that's just for the needy, that's just for particular groups of learners. And it's often conceived as being for, say, international students in our context, or for people for whom English is an additional language. An alternative view, though, is thinking about an embedded approach. And that's saying, okay, let's make this available to everyone. Let's put it in lectures. And if we create online things, that's not replacing teaching. That might be in addition. And let's make the teaching really focused on exactly what students have to do, not some kind of nice add-on Kentucky tour of things that might be nice to know, but really what students specifically have to do. And it contrasts with other approaches, various labels, but the gist is they're seen as adjunct, and they may be outsourced or online only. Wingate describes them as being bolted on, so things that kind of added on rather than integrated. And the crux here is that they're not occurring within lectures and tutorials, and full-time faculty staff aren't necessarily involved. they tend to be generic because you're restricted. You may have, say, a workshop that students can self-enroll. You might have 20 students from all sorts of disciplines. And when you're in that kind of environment, you're trying to find something, some general principle that they can connect to and apply to their context, but you're pretty restricted. You know, you can't have a conversation with a lecturer and say, that thing in your marking rubric, you know, that thing you're calling critical evaluation, tell me more about that. You don't have the luxury of being able to really look at specifically what lecturers want the students to do. And some parts of academic literacy may then be outsourced to software, or you may have external tutors doing it. So it's not surprising that critique of these approaches can be around the fact that students just struggle to connect, to see them as being relevant to what they have to do. Attendance can be an issue. And then there's the thing about access. Well, who is actually going to these? Are they the students in need? Are they the conscientious ones? Are they the ones that really need it the most? So embedded approaches, now it's pretty well established that this approach is seen as optimal because it targets what students have to do. And it doesn't make an artificial separation between academic literacy and the discipline content. So students are learning their discipline, but they're learning it through the reading and the evaluating and synthesizing and critiquing. So they're going together and not separate. In our context today, I'll be talking about the embedded approach. And we have 10 folks like me. We have about 30,000 students. So I'm a bit envious of your kind of ratios that I think that you guys have. And I'll be speaking to this ratio in the second part of the talk where I report on the research findings. Folks in my kind of role tend to have a background in education, English lit, or applied linguistics, sometimes a combination. And I think when you see the examples from today, it's important for you to know that what we're dealing with is assessment tasks that are already designed by faculty. Little analogy of a shop here, really of shopping, because we have to deal with what's in the shop, what's already created. Okay? We aren't involved, and our university doesn't have a diagnostic assessment process to determine student needs. And we aren't directly involved in the design of the assessment tasks or the instructions that might go with them. Now, informally, we may be able to have chats and influence these as we build relationships with lecturers, but it's not part of our brief. What does that mean? It means that we have to kind of work with what's there. And we're trying to extract the academic literacies that are most relevant for students. And you'll see today the examples that I'm sharing are in very constrained timeframes. So we've got some real pragmatic choices about what we select and do. When I talk about collaboration, just to clarify, I am talking about an interdisciplinary collaboration with learning advisors, or sometimes there's other names for our kind of role, but we're people who teach and research academic literacies, and we do it across disciplines. The faculty lecturers, of course, are working in the specific areas of expertise within their discipline. Generally, there's research to say, okay, in these kinds of collaborations, shared goals are important, and of course, trust is important. Now, in this presentation today, I'm agreeing with all of those things, but what we know far less about is really practically, if we're going to collaborate, how can we actually do it? What are some steps that enable us to have this shared goal? And in our context, trying to create teaching and learning that is very targeted and specific. What are we arguing and showing examples of? This combination, the lecturer's knowledge, being able to have conversations around the assessment documents like marking rubrics, and what the learning advisor brings to the table. It's this combination that enables us to be able to create teaching that's very targeted. So let's get into our first example. So Masters of Nursing Science, I'm going to show you a little bit of teaching that happened within HEL 811. Students had to do a research proposal, first time, they've never done one, and it connects to a research project in the following semester. In this context, I could have about 2 or 3 meetings with faculty. My prep time was probably about 8 hours to create things, more or less a day, and I needed to have a 2-hour interactive online lecture. Looking at the marking rubric for the research project, so connecting the proposal to the project, yep, I can gravitate to wording like critically evaluate and synthesize. One of the things I really wanted to know, and I had never worked in nursing before, is, okay, what are students having to do with nursing practice and nursing knowledge? How are they meant to connect to it in their research writing? So typically when I'm having a meeting with faculty, and this is approach shared by our team, we go on and we ask lots of questions. And I'll usually start by asking, what do the students find difficult? Or what would you really like them to know? Or what would make a big difference if we could teach it first before they submit? And in this case, I was chatting to a room full of really amazing lecturers. So imagine me, I'm sitting there. There's 5 or 6 powerful, feisty, passionate women, all really deeply committed to nursing education. And one of them starts talking about the nurse's voice. And I'm listening and I'm trying to catch on and I'm going, nurse's voice, nurse's voice. I don't really know what they're talking about. It's like, okay, I know, but I'm pretty sure they're not talking about singing. And I thought, well, maybe it's one of these situations where if I just listen a bit longer, I'll be able to catch on. Listening, yep, no, do not really know what they mean. So I have to ask, how do you know when students are doing it? And then able to extract something much more specific, that when students are doing this thing they call the nurse's voice, what are they doing? Really clearly connecting their research projects to the role of the nurse, developing knowledge, and in some cases, the capacities of the advanced capabilities of nurses. So they're doing one or more of these things in order to make it what I would say nursey, really grounded in nursing practice. So starting to get a grip now, okay, it's definitely not singing. Now, how do I know what that even looks like? So I basically asked them to share some text where it's happening. And I'll give you a glimpse of one that they shared with me. It's from a research article and it's the introduction. Now, you don't need to read this in detail, but just take you through the color coding. The yellow is specifying the focus of the research project, and clearly they're banging on about expert practice. That is the focus of the research. The blue could give us some contextual information, particular settings and times and places. Here it's quite general. The green, though, is really focusing on who's involved, so nurses, nurse managers, educators. And the red, if we look at that, it's this really strong statement, but it's important so knowledge can be transferred to. So there's no mincing of words there. They're really clearly stating why the research is important. And looking at a text like this, yeah, depending on how much time you have, you could go deep diving in a number of areas. If you're looking at the word level, you think, well, how are they grounding it to nursing practice and nursing knowledge? They're making choices like really complex nominal groups. So they're not just saying because it will make something better or because it will improve. It's, the improved management and provision of individualized care. So real choices that specify what the research is connecting to and what it's about. At a clause level, we could zoom in and go, okay, thinking about structural parts, it's really important to have beneficiaries, the green there, the recipients, to really say who it's for and who will benefit. And the circumstance also helps specify the context in which the research is either happening or could be used. Discourse level, we could zoom in on things like, well, how are they talking about value? And in this case, you can see they're saying something is important. They are not mincing their words. It's a really strong, positive evaluation of why something matters. But I think about all of that work that you could potentially do with a text is kind of like the behind the scenes analysis. Whatever knowledge you can bring to bear to a text to consider what might be important. And I think when you've got these really tight timeframes for teaching, you're thinking, well, what am I going to select? What's going to be front of house? And in this situation, there was 2 hours teaching time. Students had to do this research proposal, submit it in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. Half of them hadn't even started. So you can imagine if I came in I know, well-meaning and earnest. And I came in and said, okay, today I'm going to teach you about systemic functional linguistics, and I'm going to teach you how to do an appraisal analysis. Well, we know what would happen online. We'd get this exit stage left and students would be excusing themselves. And I realized that at that point in time, what students really just needed was a first wave understanding, a first wave building of text awareness. So really we could take all of that theory and just make prompt questions like, okay, nursing knowledge and practice. If it's visible, we can see things about what it's about, who's involved, and where it's happening and why it's important. So simple activities that we could do with students was give them an example where the nursing voice is really visible. In this activity, they had to mark up the text and then discuss with each other what they had found. And just looking at, why is it that when we read something like this, we can really easily see how it's connected to nursing knowledge and practice. Shifting from that to then a comparison, in this case, an abstract of the research proposal. Again, you could see an example where it's really clear and students found it really beneficial to actually see where it's not happening. So where it's really obscured and you're reading and that feeling of having to read something 2 or 3 times because you can't get a grip on what it's about and who's involved and why it's important. And the interesting thing for students is that when they have the ability to kind of look at something like this, even with really simple things like a prompt question, is they start to think, oh, this matters not just because this kind of nice lady called Lucy is talking to me or my lecturer is saying it's really important. They're able to see the impact of the choices of when something has been done and when it isn't been done, and how hard it can be for the reader when you don't make certain choices. The other aspect that we thought that we could touch on with them to do with the nursing voice is, well, how do you even write about the importance and significance? They've never done a project. They've had some experience of research only through reading articles, but never been in the position of having to design and do the sales pitch of why research matters. And for myself, it's like, okay, I would have an idea of how to do an applied linguistics, but I'm not a nurse, never been a nurse, never going to be one. I know how it's done in nursing. So again, having to have those conversations with the lecturer, looking at some examples, seeing some high scoring research proposals and also the research projects and saying, oh, okay, there's some language here that students can use. So we wrote some together, and then moving to a class activity, we're able to share it and show it with students. Little glimpse here, some of the language. So the 3 dot points are the kind of 3 things you can anchor for the nurse's voice: the role, the nursing knowledge, and the advanced capabilities. The blue is language that we pulled from the examples and could introduce to students and say, if you use language like this, your supervisor and then your marker of your proposal is going to be able to clearly see why your research is relevant and important. In this case, students hadn't written anything yet. If they had, they could do a comparison of what have they got in their draft, what choices, how could they perhaps make it more clear. In this case, we did breakout groups and we got them actually just trying to articulate why their research is important and doing that first verbally. So the sequence here that I'm showing you, the start of it is thinking about the nursing voice. Lecturers also wanted to have us help students think about, alrighty, number 3 there, if you're making some kind of claim about importance and significance, how can you use literature to argue for you, and what are some of your writing choices? They also wanted help within introducing and developing ideas within paragraph, particularly the lit review section. And then overall with the proposal, having some prompt questions for each section so that they basically had a little checklist to make sure they covered what they needed to in each part. That's a bit of a kind of glimpse of what happened in this 2-hour time frame. So what I'm showing you is, in order to make the assessment task expectations really visible, we just absolutely had to have conversations about what students find difficult and drawing on the lecturer's knowledge. This is not anything that I would be able to get close to without having that conversation. And then being able to really draw out why something is valued and how it gets valued. And us, I think in our role, if I had to distill it into sort of a sentence, our job is to show what success looks like and make that visible for the students. And then there's that difference between analysis we might do to understand what's happening in text and then what we might select for teaching. And I shared some examples there. So I'm showing you this little glimpse within this program in one paper. Today I'm not trying to show you like, hey, this is an example of the best teaching I've ever done or anything like that. Actually, what I'm wanting to share with you is here's an example of teaching that I could absolutely not do on my own, or if I tried to do it, it would take me an enormously long time to come up with. But through the collaboration, we're able to create something targeted. And the lecturer had never integrated any of that teaching into their practice before. They had done some assessment task preparation, but nothing so targeted and so kind of hands-on, trying to surface what good examples look like and why. I'll shift now to education. This is an example now of a second year paper. And it's a core paper. It's called The Principles of Teaching and Learning, EDUC 651. In this paper, students need to do something called a blog critique. They've never had to do one before. That's their first task. And then they also have to do a series of blog posts. And the teaching that I'll share with you now is about the blog critique. So just to clarify, they do a blog critique based on a blog post by practicing teachers. Yeah. Looking at the criteria, you can see, they've got to use concepts and terminology in their field. There's this expectation they need to critique. They've got to link the blogs to literature. They've got to also express their own personal views and connect the discussion to the role of the teacher. So talking to the course leader about what students find difficult, he's saying, okay, well, when they're looking at the blog posts, there's lots of examples of teachers and students doing things in the classroom. And what students find difficult is connecting those concrete examples to an abstract concept. And what they tend to do is also get the kind of ratios wrong. They'll write descriptively for a really long time and kind of forget to link back to the concept. So I sort of think about that, they get a bit stuck in the mud. The other two things that were going on were around being able to identify points of view and attitudes. So in the blog post, they need to see, well, what is the point of view of the author? The blog author may include other points of view, and they have to be able to separate those to say what their own point of view is. So typically, students have tended to get a bit tangled, and the markers are having a really hard time working out, hang on, what is the student teacher's own point of view? It's important to think about what they're doing here with the blog critique, how it fits into the program, and discussions with the lecturer were really important. Plus, we'd also been able to teach in the year one papers. And we could see the emphasis in year one. The student teachers at that point had done little teaching, some of them not at all. And so what they're drawing on tends to be their own life experiences or those of their family. They're doing assessments like autobiographical essays or annotated bibliographies. And at that point in time, they're being asked to think about the relevance of concepts and issues to their experiences. In year two, you can see with the blog critique, there's this extra layer now. Connect with those things, plus start engaging with the practices of others, including the points of view, dealing with evidence, having to think about reasoning, impact, and means for achieving goals. So year three, they need to do all of these things. And I look forward to collecting some text in year three, because what I think and would expect is they need to do this, plus they've now had multiple practicums. And building up to year three, they've spent quite a bit of time in the classroom, and this added layer of not just reasoning, but being able to specify future actions. So this is what I did, and this is what I might do next time. So you can see where the blog critiques kind of fit in this trajectory. And also, as newly qualified teachers, they still have to submit portfolios of evidence, and they can do that in a blog format, and they can engage with blogs and reflect on them. So there is a continuity in what they have to do. We had the privilege here of working with this paper and the same lecturer for 4 years in a row. So what we could do from year to year in terms of the behind the scenes analysis was quite substantial. And we got to build content gradually. First, we focused on the structure and features of the blog critiques, and then we're able to add in guided reading and prep. So I'll share a bit of that with you. What we really needed to get a grip on was, what is this thing called a blog critique? I mean, we had never really encountered one. The students hadn't ever done one. And all they really got to go on is instructions, kind of descriptive things of what to do. So what we did was we got the lecturer to collect some samples. We were fortunate it had been taught before, so there were samples to go by. And then we could talk with the lecturer about the good elements. And then we could kind of look at a number of high scoring blog critiques from the previous year. And we could sort of think about and talk to the lecturer about why different ones were good. And then we could actually create a model text to use in teaching. I sometimes refer to these as a kind of Frankenstein text. You have a variety of sources of models, if you like, you pull them together to create a whole that exemplifies some of the key elements. So I'll just share with you a couple of things that we chose to include in the model that we use for teaching. What we drew on, and I'll just share this briefly, a little bit of theory from LCT semantics. And what we could see in the really high scoring blog critiques was supreme control of what LCT refers to as context dependence. And you can take a concept like the importance of fostering intrinsic motivation, could be any kind of term, abstract concept in the field. And when there's wording like that, it could be about anything that is not anchored to particular time, place, setting, teacher, students doing particular things. So that gets described as having something called weaker semantic gravity. It's not tightly bound to a context. And you can look at that and look at it relative to something like observing a teacher in a classroom who's enacting a particular strategy, like giving out snacks and treats and prizes. So that's seen as having stronger context dependence. And all you really need to know about that is that in order to get a really high grade in the blog critique, students had to control this and have frequent shifts. Here's a little example. So they might start with importance, they might go to use of rewards, go to the prizes and snacks, back up to motivation, talking generally about strategies, starting to specify a little bit more, getting down to another example of an actual activity, names and ages, and doing something about characters and history, back up to extrinsic motivation. So the good blog critiques and what we chose in our model was this kind of shift, and this gets called often as semantic waving or waving. And you can see there, they don't stay long with the brown. Yep. They use the examples, but they're demonstrating their understanding of the examples by connecting them back to theoretical concepts. So in an example of a blog critique that we could show with students, you could see you could start a blog by talking about the specific concept that you're going to zoom in on. So in this case, intrinsic motivation. When you get to actually critiquing the blog itself, making sure that that's clear. So here we've got Flanagan, the blog author, emphasizes the importance of fostering intrinsic motivation. And then there are some concrete examples of prizes and snacks and so forth. But when the student then shifts to writing about their own view, making clear that they connect to the theoretical concept. So you can see that there's some movement there. The other part of the analysis that was really important is that this thing we're calling a blog critique, it is not a mind dump. it is not just a blah of this is my view and this is my opinion, or a sort of jumbled mess. It is a highly structured piece of writing. And it was actually quite surprising just to see, if you think about it in terms of social purpose, it's actually a series of genres. So one way to organize it is you just start off by zooming in on the concept, and you would call it a classifying report, and actually just dealing with that and explaining that concept. Then shifting to interpreting the main message of the blog that is being critiqued. So, and not getting sort of trying to do too much at once. Let's focus on that. And then they would often have a separate shift. Okay, now it's about me. I'm going to share my point of view. So as a student teacher who's studying childhood education, I strongly agree, and off they go. So the blog critique is this really highly structured text. And what's super hard for students is the blogs they're reading, what they have to critique, they're not organized that way. So what they have to write does not resemble what they have to read. Here's a quick example. So this blog post is about the management system. And then you have lots of sort of concrete details, what the students do each day, the child, the students, the parents asked to do this, the parents, blah, blah, blah. So what we realized is that the lecturer is saying the students find reading the blogs hard, and they find them hard to critique. And one of the things that we think was going on there is actually the blogs don't nicely organize the concepts. You kind of have to work it out. And so we designed something to help students map the concepts. So in this example, the red is the concrete examples. Students can pull those out, talk about them really easily. The heading gives them a clue of what the most general concept is, but there's a whole lot missing. And what's missing is not in the blog post. They have to get that from the literature and their reading. And in this case, they need to be able to go, oh, that example, blah, blah, what students do, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I have to identify that as a type of extrinsic reward. In this case, it's one type of motivation, which is a factor in managing classroom behavior. So that's one reason why we think they're having such difficulty reading the blogs and creating a critique. So we could teach this, this is teachable content. And we introduced this idea, we just simply called it an ideas map, that concepts are related to each other from really general to specific, and there's an in-between layer. And what they need to do is connect the examples to the sub-concepts and the main concepts in the literature. It's kind of like, well, we often talk about, what are the rules of the game? And the rules of the game are you need to connect the examples, not just to the main big abstract concept, but to this space in between. So we designed a simple activity, where a nice short blog, and we got students in class to actually draw and create their own ideas map, and they needed to explain it to another student. In this case, the map could be something like this. All the examples on the red, all those things, the hand raising, blah, blah. That's to do with manners. What's manners really about in terms of the education literature? Okay, it's about self-regulation. That's one aspect of managing classroom behavior. And being able to do it in class, of course, if students were having trouble with this middle space, they could ask the lecturer, they could ask each other and try and make the connections between the examples and specific theoretical concepts. So I've just shown you this one part of this teaching sequence. In the beginning, we did the framing. We actually used that little triangle. Originally, we created it for us to try and work out, well, what's the crux of this assignment? What's the main thing they have to do? We use that as a visual way to say, this is what you need to manage and this is what's important. Then design this sequence around the concepts and theory and how they needed to think about their reading in the blog and then get what they need from the literature. And we had a similar series to do with points of view. So being able to see the point of view of others and identify it in the reading. And then we could look with that genre analysis, like here's a really straightforward way to manage this complex task. You can do it in 3 parts. And with the note taking, meaning they can get what they need from the blog and then create the wording that they need in the actual blog critique. So again, showing you that I think we're able to zoom in and really tailor it to what students need, because we have this beautiful collaboration where we can talk about and pinpoint what students have found difficult, you know. And it's not about what we think they should do by now. It's about the reality of how are they going? How did past students go? What can we do to anticipate their needs so that they have a far better idea of what they're expected to do before submission? So the anticipation work rather than trying to repair what's been drafted or submitted. And in this case, we were able to use the knowledge of working within the program and use the lecturer's knowledge to think about, well, how does this task fit into year 1 and year 3 and beyond? And that really sort of fascinating space of, what knowledge can you bring to bear for analysis so that you understand it yourself as the teacher. You may use that analysis to create a model, and then thinking about, okay, with the time I've got, what am I going to select for teaching? And in this case, shared with you a little bit about reading as preparation for writing, to add on to the work we've done to do with the structure of the blog. And again, just sharing this example, like the first one, there's no way I would have any idea how to teach a blog critique in a way that was targeted and meaningful for year 2 students in a core paper of the BA program. Absolutely have to have this beautiful relationship of talking about what students need and bringing together really 2 different knowledge bases to create the targeted teaching. So pausing there, we have now covered some examples of the types of collaboration. Part 2, I'll share some research about this specific paper where they're doing the blog critiques. That will include touching on impact. So you may have some questions about how the students went and how the lecturers found it. I'll be saving those. But if you'd like to have any comments or questions to do with this process of working with the lecturers, love to hear from you. And Namala, you're going to share this, right?
Yes, and please feel free to put it into the chat box, and I can read it out for everyone, or just ask the question by unmuting yourself. Thank you, Lucy. That was really interesting.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm Patrick. I just have a question about the implementation of what you discover. So you're able to plan these teaching activities and create some, is it materials that the students handle on their own, or do you actually have a 2-hour lesson with them? How do you handle the implementation of what it is you've discovered?
Yeah, thank you. So in the 2 examples I gave you, they were 2-hour lectures. So we did the teaching, and in the second part of the talk, I'll actually talk about how those roles of who did the teaching shifted. And in the case of the longer collaboration, we were able to create 6 to 7 mini videos that were distilled teaching points from the lecture, chopped up, segmented, and students could access them at any time on the learning management system. So we're kind of addressing those 2 modes.
So just to clarify, so some were face-to-face teaching or like this virtual teaching, but with the students live, and some was like self-access. The students obtain it, the videos on their own time, but related directly to the program.
Yes, so what we did was we didn't want the videos to kind of replace the teaching, because you can see the teaching was not really lecture style. It was basically, let's teach a bit, try a bit, teach a bit, try a bit. Very sort of interactive, much more like a 2-hour workshop. And then the content of those teaching inputs, those were distilled into videos. Yeah.
Sorry, sorry to keep asking, but does that mean you had both for that group of students? They had both the lesson as well as the resource they could watch again later?
That's right. So, and it was, we created the videos after the teaching, so we could post, say, hey, we now have some videos for you. But in other collaborations, we may create videos first, but the idea is it's the same material that they can experience both face-to-face and in the video form as a way of revisiting the material if they want to. And we've got some data that we've just prepared for management really about the question of, okay, if we're creating videos, are students accessing it? And we get really high view rates. In a couple of the papers that we were looking at recently, there were things like over a 2-year period around 2,000 views. And I think some of the viewers who were like first-time viewers, so there's like about 600 viewers, but they're looking at it collectively 2,000 or 3,000 times. So each viewer is actually looking at the video a couple of times. So the unique viewers is much smaller than the number of total views. So we are finding we are getting students really accessing the videos that we create, and we'd love to research, track that.
I have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Lucy, it's been really interesting so far. With the semantic gravity wave profile that you showed us, I'm interested to know if you shared that with the faculty as well, or whether you dumbed it down a bit.
No, actually, in this case, I started looking at that in about the 3rd iteration of the paper. And I definitely think it's really teachable. Yep. And we have done it in other papers where there's been a reflective writing element. And sometimes we've just called it the wave and just said abstract concept, concrete details. So we've really simplified the meta language and shown that the relationship of, in a way, we framed it with wording like, you're showing and telling us the examples as a way of demonstrating that you understand the concepts. Yeah. And so we try to make that really explicit. So the answer for you here is that we didn't do it in this paper, but I absolutely think it could be done, and we have done it elsewhere. And I think you can do it in very uncomplicated ways. Like if you're just doing a one-shot wonder class where you can't build knowledge over time, yeah, then you can really simplify the meta language.
We have a question from Daniel. Daniel, I'll just read it out from the chat box for Lucy. So, hi Lucy, could you give us insight into how you and your team developed legitimacy and buy-in in the eyes of the lecturers and teaching teams, and how easy, challenging this was?
I might just read that question. I'm not quite sure I understand.
So I think about.
Oh yeah. Okay, so there's two. We've got 2 patterns that go on for us. One, we have what we call like a faculty champion. So it'll be someone who's worked with us, who might then just sort of grab us for a number of papers that they have to teach. So papers in New Zealand, same as course. And so we might have that relationship, and then they can be kind of used as a platform for vocalizing the kind of work we do and why it matters and the kind of impact that we can have. In the School of Education, we actually had a much more top-down approach. So we had a fairly elaborate design process over a couple of days where with buy-in from the head of school, a number of BEd lecturers met with us and helped us design how we might implement academic literacy teaching in the core papers from year 1, 2, and 3. So they were involved in discussing all the assessment tasks together and trying to work, okay, what will we teach in year 1? How can we build on it in year 2 and 3? So that was a top-down approach, but I think you can kind of, work from both angles. Program-wide, yeah, I do think you really need the buy-in from the leadership of that school, because you need to create an expectation that people are going to give up some of their precious lecture time. It's not added on, it's not another thing, it's in the core teaching time. So you kind of want some powerful people to clear that space for you. So thank you for the question, Daniel. Yeah.
Another question in the chat, Lucy, from Anita.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Was the students' feedback gathered after these sessions, and how will find it, which I think is the second part of your talk, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'd say that we have indirect comments from students. we would love to, as part of the project that I'll introduce in part 2, that focuses on the collaboration and what the lecturers thought. We could easily design and extend that to student perspectives. Anecdotally, we get this sort of overwhelming positive gratitude that someone is actually explaining with the lecturer what's important and what they have to do before they submit. Yeah. But love to capture that as powerful research data. What do you reckon? Part 2?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe more questions after part 2. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, great. Yep. So this part will be sort of around 20 minutes. So if you think of things that you would like to discuss and bring up, please note them and we can have another chat. Okay, our research project is called the CELC project. And you can see in the examples that I shared with you, even though they were brief, working with lecturers and creating targeted materials is pretty intensive. Yeah. And for learning advisors, when you see the ratio of something like 10 of us to 30,000 students, and imagine the number of courses and programs, we were really kind of interested in exploring, is it possible to design targeted materials and then at some point hand them over so that the lecturer is doing the teaching, and thereby freeing up the learning advisors to create other things like mini videos or move to another course or program. So we're really interested to actually try out that process, have a bit of an experiment. You can see the research team there. There's a bunch of learning advisors and 2 of the faculty lecturers. And we're talking about the work we did in that blog critique paper, EDUC 651. So it's just in that paper that we thought, let's try this out, let's explore this space. What might be possible and what do lecturers think about it? And there is a little bit of student data that I'll add on. So we wanted to know about the roles and contributions and how they might shift over time. And yeah, how did lecturers find this experience? In terms of the data, just sharing with you briefly that focusing on who did what over time, we had audio recorded transcriptions of meetings, so meetings to talk about the teaching and to design the teaching and to share drafts of things. And we also took some collaboration notes, trying to keep track of who did what, because obviously, you know, this happens very dynamically. There's meetings, there's phone calls, there's emails. Yep. And we did some fairly straightforward analysis. I'm just looking at the clause of who is doing what. And we're also interested in terms of the time. Bring that one up. Zoom delay, just 1 second. Yep, that second part there is interested in, okay, so what's the temporal organization of what's happening? So we just did, you know, simple analysis of when things happened and whether happening at the same time or sequentially. The hard part really was actually for the wonderful colleagues who actually did the work of the note taking and the documenting what was done as they're, you know, madly trying to teach. So what we wanted to populate with that kind of analysis is to go year by year, looking at the current things that we did to create the teaching materials, and in particular about the teaching sequence and the activities, and then who is doing the teaching. So I'll share findings about that. I'm not going to show you all the behind the scenes analysis, but we'll just be populating this table. What we realized is there are 2 main parameters when you think about the contribution, like the things that were being created, were they being done more individually or more collaboratively? So one of the parameters. The second one was, you know, who was taking a leading role? Was it more lecturer-led or was it more learning advisor-led, and what happened over time? You put those 2 parameters together and you get a topology of embedded practices. And we could see that in 2017, we were more in this top quadrant, which we call guest lecturing and endorsing. So the learning advisor is definitely leading, and it's mostly an individual effort with some collaboration. What that looked like in terms of who did what. You can see that discussing the task and thinking about teaching was a joint effort. The course leader did the work of finding the sample text, but then the learning advisor, did the lion's share, the analysis, creating the sample text for teaching purposes, and developing the sequence and the activities and actually doing the teaching. And let's see what happened in 2018. Really big shift towards things being far more collaborative. And you can see with this topology, there's the quadrants, but the dotted circle is where the activity happens. So, it's not neatly only in that one space. Of course, there is a degree. So all I'm saying here is 2018 was relatively far more collaborative than the previous year. And the kind of evidence we have from the analysis is, so you have both discussing the assessment task and the teaching points. The little arrows are not that something wasn't done, but that work was done in 2017, so it didn't need to be done again. So it was carried through time. And you see in this year, the both is happening with the teaching sequence. So really fine tuning and tweaking what was done. What can we do better? How can we make it clearer? And then the tweaking of class activities. So the lecturer is far more involved there. But in terms of delivering the teaching in class, that's still being done by the learning advisor. 2019, it's a really interesting space because there is some distribution of who is doing what. So we've called that distributive designing and teaching. And some things are done individually, but still a lot is done collaboratively. And what that looks like from the analysis point of view is this. So the course leader has gone back to find some more samples so we could do a bit of top up. The LA has individually done the analysis. The developing and fine tuning of the teaching sequence and activities is done together, but this time the course leader does the teaching. They take over and actually teach in the class. And the learning advisor then is freed up to think about, okay, let's make some segmented videos based on this teaching content. In 2020, has what we call handover. So here, the course leader is again teaching, and all of that work from those previous years is being carried over, and he's using materials, he's using what's already been created, and he's doing the teaching. And the learning advisor was available, but was actually not needed. So there's a smooth transition towards the course lecturer doing everything. And that's what it looks like over time. This gradual shift from the learning advisor doing the lion's share to far more collaboration. What's been created is then used, and that's contributing to the course leader then being able to do the teaching. So the topology, when it's neatly configured, it looks like that. And you can see that the actual activity, there was a bit of overlap with quadrants, but we could see this shift from guest lecturing to much more co-designing and observing. So the lecturer is still observing. Then there's this real distribution that the course leader is able to do the teaching, and that does free up the learning advisor to do other things. And then there's a handover in 2020. Now, from the lecturer's point of view, the handover was possible. And he says it really frankly, he's like, it wasn't like someone suddenly turning up and saying, here you go. Yep. The example he uses, like when a colleague is sick and you have to suddenly do their teaching and you barely have a grip on what you have to teach, but you give it your best shot. He's saying it wasn't like that process. In fact, he said, it's not really like a handover. It's not plonk. It's this gradual process. And for him, that's what enabled it to be quite smooth. But what he did draw attention to was that in what he described as a transfer of responsibility, this kind of model, that's his wording, the way he could kind of conceptualize it. You can see that it doesn't mean that the lecturer is kind of out of there, right? It doesn't mean that the learning advisor has collaborated and then they're gone. There's not this withdrawal of support. It's not like, okay, over to you, I'm gone. What he said that he thought would be really important for this type of exploration where you want to hand over is that when there's a staffing change or the assessment task changes, or you gain new insights about what's challenging for students and you want to create new things, he's saying that you need some flexibility with this kind of modeling. So you need to be able to move between quadrants. And I think that's what's a beautiful thing about a topology is we're not assuming a fixed and linear progression from the learning advisor doing most of it to the lecturer. You can move between quadrants as needed. And he thought that that would be particularly important, say, when you had a new staff member who was lecturing in that paper for the first time. I'll share with you now some really fascinating findings about what they thought of this whole process and what they thought of this notion of handover. And we've got audio recorded interviews. And I'll give you just a bit of a sense of what the analysis was. We did some analysis of the attitudes using some SFL here. And just briefly, SFL differentiates between affect, which is more about emotions. So you could say the students really love the videos, or judgment, which is about behavior and things people do, and it gets at capacity and it gets at things like ethics. So not offering videos disadvantages students would be an example of judgment. And you can also then value things. So the videos provided a learning experience. And a shout out to the 2021 article there with some of your own stuff, that it's a beautiful publication that shows some of the coding conventions that have been established over time, and it does so really clearly. And I've got them there. So when you have bold, like loved, you've got attitude inscribed in the wording. So it's really clear, like loved or disadvantages. You might have a bit more implied though. It's kind of not so directly encoded in the wording. You might have something like a learning experience. In the contents of the text, it's like, well, it's regarded as a good thing. And then you make clear what the attitude is directed towards, that match between the attitude and what is evaluated. So what do the students love? They love the videos, and that gets underlined. So if you're interested in that, I can shout out to the core text of Martin and White and then this beautiful article from 2021. And so I'll just share with you some findings. I'm not going to do all the detailed analysis, but I'll mention it a little bit verbally. Yep. What the lecturers were, both of them, commenting on is about new insights about the assessment tasks. And they were judging in a positive way the capacity of learning advisors, and they spoke about complementary knowledge. What was really interesting is that they used language like that the learning advisors were unpacking or breaking down the assessments. So they were basically saying the learning advisor is focusing on the how and they're focusing on the what, and those things go beautifully together. So I'll share with you a couple of extended and powerful quotes. So lecturer 2 is saying, when you see somebody start to unpack your assignment, you think, bloody hell, that's complicated. We do seem to set this most extraordinarily convoluted triple, quadruple, 8-parted beast in talking about the assessment. Often we add another little bit because students didn't get that bit. So we'll write another 3 sentences of explanation. And then by the end of it, 3 years down the track, it's like this huge beast of a thing. So she's, natively appraising the assessments, and the lecturers, they don't often get a chance to kind of change it. Once they realize there might be an issue, they have to roll with what's been approved. They can't change it midway, and they often inherit assessments that are designed by others. Yeah. And then further down, you can see the last part of the purple there. She can see this idea that the knowledge of the process is held by the learning advisors, and the knowledge of the content from the lecturer, and she sees that as being beautifully woven together. So she's praising the teaching and what gets created for students as being stunning. The first lecture is he was a course leader. It was also quite similar You can see in the top there, he's saying, you know, he likes being able to get someone else's perspective and that it's beneficial for him as well as the students. Focusing then on the blue. So he's saying that what the learning advisors is contributing is this knowledge about, and they're really trying to think about the mechanics of the assessment. How are they going to navigate that? How are students actually going to go about doing these things? And that's what he positively praises as being the benefit of the collaboration. That the lecture advisors get it, so the learning advisors get it, the how and the mechanics. And what he sees it as is that when you have that combination, students get, you can see the last bit in purple, they get a much more rounded picture. In terms of this little experiment of ours to gradually do handover, the course leader, the one who'd worked with us for 4 years, he expressed really sort of, you know, positive reaction to the experience. Pretty straightforward. It was good. Wasn't difficult at all. Wasn't awkward in any way. Yeah. He then has some really interesting judgments about when our lecturers are able to work with learning advisors over time. So I hope that you're having a look at that one. So it's interesting, he's basically saying, okay, if we're going to do this thing called handover and you're working over time, he thinks, you know, that lecturers do have the capacity. He feels that it's possible for them to have developed their own capabilities to be able to manage it. So it's a positive judgment on the capacity of lecturers to do academic literacies teaching. And then really interesting, his judgment gets a bit more ethical, because he's basically saying, you know, they're working with you over time, they should have learned something for themselves. And he says if they haven't, then they need to look at their own sort of professional approach. And I think what he's getting at there is that if you're working and collaborating over time, he's saying you shouldn't really be staying in that top quadrant where the learning advisor has a permanent guest lecturer status and comes in year after year and does the same thing without there being further contribution from the lecturer. So it's interesting for him, it's possible, it was smooth because it was gradual, and he understands the context of trying to do it, and yeah, things that we should be able to pass things on. Second lecturer, she's worked with us a lot over different papers. She had only worked in this particular paper for 1 year, but her comments are based on her work with us across, you know, a number of papers in the Bachelor of Education program. She's got a really different point of view. So let's check out what she says. She's focused on not this idea necessarily of it's possible, but what is actually best for the students, what she calls optimal learning experiences. Here's what she says. We should be teaching to our strengths and our expert knowledge, and this is not mine. I want the learning advisors there. I want their expertise. I'm not bringing the depth to it. I'm the parrot. And I can bring in anecdotes from my own knowledge to liven things up, but I'm still the parrot. And she says the students are not getting the depth of the nuances. I think those skills of unpacking and assessment belong with the learning advisors. They're the experts. And we want to use that expertise. And you can see this really strong judgment about the whole ethics of thinking about a handover, saying it devalues the expertise you bring, and she says that a number of times. And the thing about these comments, it's interesting, because she's not straight out saying I can't do it. She's sort of questioning the kind of authenticity of doing it, this idea of mimicking, of being a parrot, going through the motions of being able to do it. If we think about these comments in relation to some past research findings, with similar kind of collaborations. In other studies, some lecturers are saying a bit more straight up that they felt they did not possess sufficient relevant knowledge to do the embedded literacies teaching. Another angle on that is that, look, it's just not my job. You know, it's someone else's responsibility. But I don't think that's what lecturer 2 is really saying, because if you dig deeper into the interview, she focuses on the importance of academic literacy. The skills that we want for them to do for assessments are probably the skills they're going to use in life, the process parts of the assignment. And they're actually what matters. That how is crucial. So for her, it's the issue of what has been taught is so precious. It extends beyond the bounds of that particular assessment task. You know, we should have experts in there with the teaching. So she is questioning the whole notion of handover and why we would even strive to explore it and why we would even think about doing it. Because she thinks that we should be collaborating and that's what's best for the students. So two really contrasting perspectives there. One, it's possible and it was pretty smooth because it was gradual. And yep, if we're working together over time, yep, I think lecturers should be able to do it. And this other view of why are we even thinking about handover? You know, why can't we keep collaborating? Why can't we keep drawing on the strengths of two different knowledge bases? What I can share with you about the students is a little more anecdotal. So the lecturer reported that as we develop these materials, both the lectures and the videos to complement the lectures, that he found he was spending far less time on student queries. Now in hindsight, I think, oh wow, I wish we could quantify that. That would be powerful. But what he does attribute some of that reduction to is comments that he heard the students say. So we haven't collected that directly, but he's asked them and he said they felt that the things they were worried about were in the materials. So he was fielding far fewer emails, queries being, you know, pinged after class and asked lots of questions or during class. The other thing that we can share about impact on students is to do with the resubmission rates for the assessments. I was able to collect this data. And you know, prior to the collaboration, you can see the rate of that 7.4, and then it's sort of third and fourth iteration, that resubmission rate is being halved. Again, we are looking at different groups of students, but some pattern of a reduction. In papers like this one, it's particularly important because the students actually have to pass every single assessment task. So the base grade, 50% is a C, and the lecturer has to work really hard to get everyone up to that, the required level. So resubmissions can be a big deal if there's a lot of them. The other data that we can access that is far more kind of problematic to try and make claims about is to do with student grades and being able to look at how a cohort of students went and the distribution of grades. So I'll share that with you. So what are we looking at? We have got 5 different groups of students. So we're not tracking the same. We do have the same course leader. Blue is the percentage of students getting an A, orange B, grey C. And just reminding you then, 2016, there's no collaboration. 2017 and 18, we have the collaboration starting and the learning advisors doing the teaching. I can't account for why, like today, I can't answer why in 2017, 52% got an A. I can't account for why that happened or why it wasn't necessarily sustained in a different group of students in 2018. I need to go back and have a look at the teaching materials and think about the delivery. Did we do something really different there? There are a couple of things that were different, but so many variables, I'm not sure. Was it a bumper crop of students? Did these students in 2017 do well in all of the core papers? Not this one, not sure. What I really wanted to know though was at the point of handover, so when the course leader is actually doing the teaching, what happened? And we can see at that point, the A range is similar. There's actually more B's and fewer C's. And I think, what can we say? I think we can safely say that the handover wasn't a disaster, and it wasn't a disaster, from this perspective of the grade ranges. Maybe some indication you've got more B's happening is that, maybe we need to explore, do students actually do better when the course leader is doing the teaching? Obviously, we would need multiple iterations to make any claim like that. And then we have the COVID year. Pretty tough to consider, you know, what we could say about that year. Anecdotally, the lecturer thinks there's something about the mini videos providing a second or third way for students to engage with material. He thinks there's something to do with that and the relationship to having, you know, 61% getting a B range. Do you have a reduction in A's though? And my lecturer yesterday was saying to me that was happening across the board in the School of Education. So what are we looking at? Well, this kind of data is tough, right? It's, you know, what claims can we make? How strong can we make our claims? What can we say we feel is a contributing factor? Really entering the space of the challenge we have, you know, with showing our value and our impact, both quantitatively and qualitatively. We do have a little growing body of research here that relates this kind of teaching to the assessment grades and pass rates and resubmission rates. And I think there's a number of areas that we need to explore as we start to really make the case for the kind of difference this teaching can make. Of course, student texts or whatever it is they're creating, how do they go from one assignment to the next? How do they go across a paper? In the same way we've gathered insights about the lecturer's experiences, we can see what students value. An area that, you know, isn't researched much is not just this sort of perceptions or assessment outcomes and grades, is things like uptake in the student talk about writing. So if you think of all the oomph that goes into teaching like a blog critique, and if you introduce something like attitude, how to identify it, how to express it, do students connect that to a future task? And if they do connect it, is there even any evidence that they're carrying through time the same ways of talking about it and building on their knowledge? And I think we can also keep thinking about the lecturer practice, the extent to which that can change through the collaboration. So there's a lot of work for us to do. We're going to roll up our sleeves, people, and keep contributing to how we think we can show value and impact. And if you're researching and teaching in this kind of space, please reach out. I'd love to hear from you. We have some publications based on the project, one published and then some coming. And we have a fourth one that's about halfway through the pipeline. And if you're interested in any of the theory or past research that I've mentioned that's been collected by our team, please contact me. I'd love to hear from you. So folks, we still have a nice little bit of time for any questions or queries you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. That was an amazing talk. And you just took us through such a tremendous amount of, I think, a really thoughtful process of going from the start to the end of an entire embedding sequence, which I think is so valuable that we rarely see the whole process, as well as the kinds of materials you developed and how you developed them, which is so valuable to us. I'm just going to look at some of the questions that came up on the chat. So one of the questions, maybe just to start off, if anyone wants to join in after this and put their microphone on and just add to the questions, that's fine. I just wanted to point out that one of the chat questions was, what are the main characteristics of the videos?
Yeah, coming from a colleague, can I just clarify there? Hi, thank you for the question. Characteristics of the videos, what in particular do you mean? Can you please say a tiny bit more?
So just from the person who asked the question.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Look, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, sure can.
Yeah. Hey, Luce.
Hey.
Yeah, no, it's just because the videos are so important as sort of like we're playing with words like connective tissue or connective learning tasks, etc. But I was just wondering about how they played off what is it, the synchronous stuff that you were doing in class and the asynchronous stuff that you had in the videos. The characteristics would be something like, and I don't mean to prompt you, short, sharp, sweet, that sort of thing. So
yeah, thanks. So, and we're having a question about the videos, and yeah, that's why we need to show you some examples. But I think what we could say is that we take a lecture, and particularly our lectures, the way we're doing, are really interactive. So we're not like recording the whole thing 2 hours where students are doing things. We're like going, we're separating the teaching points and segmenting them. So there'd be things like, identifying concepts and then mapping the concepts, or identifying points of view and mapping points of view. We chop it up. We try to keep it under 3 minutes, ideally around 1.5 minutes. There's some interesting research, and we need to do a bit of top-up reading to see what's happened in these COVID times. But a study a little while back looked at 5 million video views and looked at student engagement. And after 6 minutes, nearly everyone had dropped off. And the sort of window was like 1 to 3 minutes. And so that's some of what the research we've based our design around. And it's meant we've had to really focus on a core teaching point and segment it. And the other thing we can't assume is a sequence in which someone will watch a video. Okay? So yeah, the characteristics are to really just to try to distill the teaching point, strip out the activities, don't put any other nice to know things, keep it really focused and short and sharp. Yeah. And we have a YouTube channel actually that doesn't have all of the embedded work, but it's AUT literacies for assessments. Mark, I wonder if you could maybe chuck that into the chat if you're still listening. That's Mark Bassett. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mark will put the link to the YouTube channel and you can see an example.
That would be
The type of, and we're trying to get better at these ourselves, right? In the teacher training that we did some decades ago, having to make educational videos was not on the curriculum. So we are very much trying to look at research and work it out together.
I have another question from a colleague who's actually left the session, but wanted to have you address these questions, and they're going to listen to the recording. So they just wanted to ask about what kind of, I think they mean, what kind of academic literacy proficiency do the lecturers have? How much knowledge about language, I suppose? And what happens when the course lecturer or course coordinator changes? So do the learning advisors have to come back in to go through this process again so that they can let the lecturers become familiar with the kind of material that you've created?
Yeah. So the second part of that question, yes, I think when the teaching staff changes, we have to kind of rebuild the relationship. It depends a bit on the handover between staff. So if a lecturer has passed on and they've really explained, then a lot of that work gets done. But it's so relational, isn't it? You're asking people to give up lecture time to help students prepare for an assessment. So yeah. And then the first part was, what kind of knowledge do they have? I don't have an answer to that. In my experience of being an AT for a few years, some have, well, maybe the generalization, it's there. As research is saying, it's a bit more tacit. So for example, the nurse's voice, I use that example. So when I started to do a bit of an annotation, said, okay, we need students to be able to see, and they have to write who's involved, and you sort of do that type of annotation. The lecturer's like, I've never thought about it that way, but yes, that's exactly what I want them to do. So I sort of feel like our knowledge is about really listening hard to what they want. We don't come in with a toolkit and say, let me, I got this list of 1 to 10 things, choose what you want. We actually just try to say, what do they care about? And then how can we try to make visible and teachable what they care about? Yeah. So in that sense, it's not so much about what they know. It's about our ability to draw out what's important and work with them to find an example that we can use to show what is important. I think that is the crux of it.
I just actually wanted to add on to what you said there and ask about when you first go into faculty and meet with them and speak to the lecturers, how much do you feel that your role as a learning advisor, I mean, you've talked about listening, right? So how much of it is about trying to build that trust about what kind of content they bring in terms of their knowledge, and how you can bridge the gap between that and academic literacy by bringing in your knowledge? So how much of it is a collaborative process of listening, and do you feel that there's certain compromises that you have to make in that first part where you are speaking to the lecturer about what their discipline knowledge and content knowledge is before you bring in your expertise? So it's a kind of negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think about it slightly differently, not really so much as a compromise, but more of there's a huge relief for lecturers, I think, when you come in and you're not imposing what you think should be done. But when you ask the questions like, what do students find difficult? If we could teach one thing that you think might make a really big difference to the assignments that you're having to mark, what would that be? And you kind of come in from that angle, and then you work with what they put out there. And then you're basically not in a position where it's competing. So I think there is that interpersonal thing where you're coming in and you basically work with what they want. Yeah. And I think, yeah, that takes a kind of gentle approach. And then I think the other thing that's helpful is that sense of control. So as you start to explore what's teachable, I think, I know I've certainly done this, and we did this a bit in our team, is sometimes you go really far down the track, like you create a whole teaching sequence, you flick it to the lecturer who's super busy, and you say, hey, you got any feedback? And then mostly what are you going to get? Yep, that's great, thanks. Yeah. But if you don't go too far down the track and say, hey, I'm thinking of this kind of sequence, can we have a chat? And you talk through, and then they can have the waiting, I want more of this, less of that. Actually, I don't want that at all. I want something else. Then they have input. And then there's that kind of sense, now you can roll. So I think that intermediate step of presenting teaching options and now allows lecturers to have the control, and you're not putting them in a position where you're so far down the track that they would feel bad giving you feedback, and you actually get something a bit more genuine. Yeah.
Okay. So any other questions?
Oh, we've got an interesting comment there. Sometimes what they want is not what they need. Oh, I mean, I think maybe I could take a comment like that. You know, sometimes what they ask for initially doesn't end up being what you teach. So you can negotiate that. I think when you position yourself as having complementary knowledge, but you're not in this sort of surface, or I'll do whatever you ask me. Go. You can start with an inquiry, and so we might get something typically like APA referencing, and then you can kind of transform that and go, okay, so what do they have to do? And say, oh, they're doing literature review. Okay, so let's talk about how you bring in literature. And of course we can cover little conventions around APA, but the teaching point isn't about where to put commas and full stops with APA referencing. We can actually flick a video. Here's a 2-minute video to watch about that. You can kind of take that first connection and negotiate it to be something that will have more impact, or potentially have more impact and be of more importance for students. So I think that's interesting. Hey, what do you start with, and how do you then negotiate what gets taught?
Thanks, Lucy. Are there any other questions? I'm not sure whether I've missed anyone's questions on the chat box. Mark, anything you'd like to add?
No, just that it's been absolutely fascinating, really interesting, insight into your work. And like you said, Nirmala, the whole process of starting out from the student perspective, from the lecturer perspective, it's been very interesting and very informative. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for this beautiful, luxurious time frame. Yeah, and thank you for all those who've connected. Yeah, been lovely to spend some time with you. And please do reach out. You know, my details are there. Comments, queries. If you're working on something that you think that I might be interested in and connect with, or you just want to have a chat, please do. Love to hear from you.
Okay, I think we'll just wrap it up then. If there are no other questions, lots of comments saying thank you so much for that presentation, which was amazing, Lucy. We really appreciate it. It's such a complex process, and just to see how carefully you've thought about it, and that you're aligning your research to that, to looking back at it and seeing the process of embedding and how involved the learning advisors get, and how they withdraw that support, and all those things I think are very relevant to so many of us who are teaching in EAP and embedding into different disciplines. And of course, these big questions about interdisciplinarity, which is sort of the focus of many universities, I think now more than ever. So thank you so much. I just wanted to say that we have a little token of appreciation for you, which I've emailed to you. It's a little book voucher from Books Actually, which is a book in Singapore, just to thank you for your time and for this amazing, well thought out presentation, which is so useful to all of us. For everyone who's here today, thank you so much for joining us. We just wanted to say that we will be hosting Lucy's recorded talk on our blog as well. So we will be in touch about that when that resource becomes available, if you want to go back and look at anything and any of the resources that she uses, her references, etc. So thank you so much. Lucy, thanks again, everyone. Big round of applause for Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care, girl.
All right, bye. Thanks, everyone. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks. Hi, Mark.
Thanks, Nam. I
Oh,
didn't know who Maureen Rogers is. Do you?
Just let me